From its brutal beginnings to the global phenomenon that it is today, the UFC has transformed the sport of MMA as a whole in ways no one would have even imagined back God knows when, okay? But through this journey, there's been multiple eras of the UFC, multiple different time periods that distinguish themselves from each other, that had different themes, different rules, different fighters that represented their era. And today I thought we'd take a journey through time and explore every era that shaped the UFC as it is today. The first era that we got is the Wild West era between 1993 and 1996. It all began in 1993, the very first UFC event in Denver, Colorado. It had one goal: to find out which martial art was the most effective in a real fight, with no weight classes, no time limits, and very few rules. The Octagon became a battleground for some of the most brutal and chaotic fights we would have saw. Royce Gracie, representing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, shocked the world by dominating much larger opponents, showing that technique could overcome size and strength. But it wasn't just about Gracie's dominance. Fighters like Ken Shamrock, Tank Abbott, and Dan Severn helped give this early era its chaotic and unpredictable feel. Back then, literally everything went okay. Headbutts, groin shots, hair pulling, it was a free-for-all. Pretty much, it was barely even sanctioned fights. The Octagon was just there for jokes. It was really just street fights at the end of the day with a ref there just to make sure he didn't actually kill the other guy, okay? This was MMA's Wild West era, and it was the general foundation for what the sport could become and what the UFC could build upon to make the sport better. Next era that we got is the Dark Ages, man. Shit was fucked up, okay? Between 97 and 2000. As the UFC grew in popularity, it also drew heavy criticism, okay? Politicians like Senator John McCain spearheaded a campaign to ban the UFC, calling it human cockfighting, okay? The backlash was swift and severe, with cable companies pulling UFC events from pay-per-view and many states refusing to host the fights in general, like big no-go. Without mainstream access, the UFC was forced underground. They held events in states like Alabama and Wyoming, far from the bright lights of like LA or some shit, you know what I'm saying? Pay-per-view sales dropped and the company's future was in serious jeopardy, okay? Despite the decline in visibility, some of the sport's first true champions began to emerge during this time. UFC introduced weight classes to level the playing field so people didn't have like crazy fucking weight advantages. Frank Shamrock, an early pioneer in modern MMA techniques, became the first light heavyweight champion, while Randy Couture, a Greco-Roman wrestler, started building his legacy as one of the greatest fighters of his era as well. To save itself from extinction, the UFC began instituting key rule changes: rounds, time limits, weight classes, and the banning of the most brutal techniques like eye gouging and headbutts. Slowly, it started gaining legitimacy, but the company was still on the verge of collapse. Moving on to the next era. Now we're out of the Dark Ages, okay, but we're still not doing too hot, okay? But in 2001, the Fertitta brothers and the big boy Dana White, okay, fucking Dana White, you might recognize that name, purchased the UFC for $2 million. What they were buying was not a successful sports league, but a struggling company. White, a former boxing manager, took over as president and immediately set about cleaning up the UFC's image. The first step? The unified rules of MMA. The UFC now had rounds, judges, mandatory gloves, and a comprehensive list of fouls. The sport had evolved into something more professional and more disciplined. To try get the UFC away from that human cockfighting image, which was fucking stupid in the first place. But anyway, with these changes, new stars begin to emerge. Tito Ortiz, known for his brutal ground and pound, became a superstar as a light heavyweight champ, being one of the first real dominating guys. You know, he got 5 title defenses, while Chuck Liddell and his ferocious knockout power captured the imagination of fans. These rivalries gave the UFC its first true marquee fight as well, with Tito and Chuck, which was the biggest fight at the time. But the true turning point in this Zua era and the Ultimate Fighter boom between 2001 and 2007 was in 2005 with the Ultimate Fighter, a reality TV show where fighters lived together and competed for a UFC contract. The show introduced millions to MMA, and its final, the legendary Forrest Griffin vs. Stephen Bonner fight, is still considered one of the greatest and most important fights in UFC history. This fight alone saved the UFC. Dana said it himself. This is where the UFC went from surviving to beginning to go into the era of actually thriving and being a successful company. The next era that we got is the GSP and Anderson Era, and I don't really know what else to call this era, okay? This spans from 2007 to 2013, with the UFC firmly established into the just outside the mainstream. You know, it wasn't shunned, but like obviously it wasn't as big as like the fucking like NFL or, you know, the NBA or some shit like that. The sport reached new heights of athleticism and strategy. George St. Pierre, the welterweight king, was a master of controlling fights with his wrestling and athleticism. His dedication to perfection inside and outside the octagon made him one of the most respected fighters in MMA history. At the same time, Anderson Silva was rewriting the records as the UFC middleweight champion. His style was unlike anything we saw before, a fluid combination of precise striking, head movement and showmanship. Silva held the middleweight belt for nearly 7 years, defending his title 10 times, and it fucking should have been 11, okay? His opponent missed weight on his first title defense, so it technically didn't count. Legends like Randy Couture, who became a champion 2 weight classes in BJ Penn, who also ruled multiple divisions, cemented their place in MMA history. This was a golden age of champions, okay, who held their belts with iron fists. This was the first era where we really got dominant champs, and we had champions who were good at every single asset of the game. You know, it really became mixed martial arts. I feel like this is the era where we left the kind of specialist shit behind. You know, just like people being good at one thing like kickboxing, wrestling, jiu-jitsu. And people were good at everything, okay? And also the UFC was drawing in new massive audience with fights like fucking Brock Lesnar, okay? Brock Lesnar was a huge fucking help for the UFC. Biggest star he had until, you know, an Irishman came in later. But the UFC was really stepping up in this era, and it really became about the mixed martial arts. Moving on to the McGregor era, okay? This spans from like 2013 to like 2016, maybe even like 2018 if you want to push it that far. And what was this era about? This era was about one guy, fucking Conor McGregor. Okay, you had John Jones, who was doing this shit at the time, you know, putting up his fucking legacy, you know, stacking title defense after title defense. But all the general public gave a single fuck about was Conor McGregor. Okay, that was all. You also had Ronda Rousey, who was like, you know, big up woman, you know what I'm saying? But Conor McGregor was taking the men's divisions by storm with his brash trash talk, confident predictions, Mystic Mac, and one-punch knockouts. Okay, McGregor captivated the world. His 13-second knockout over Aldo to win the featherweight title remains one of the most iconic moments in UFC history, like ever. Okay, Conor made you had Nunes, who was beating the fuck out of every single woman at the time, okay? You had people like Kamaru Usman, who was coming up, dominating, Volkanovski coming up, dominating, and the UFC also proved its adaptability during the COVID, you know, shit. Dana White and his team launched Fight Island in Abu Dhabi, where events continued despite global shutdowns. And this move, man, the UFC was the only fucking sport and shit on. So people now have shit to watch, you know what I'm saying? So it gave a lot of eyes to the UFC, and with the multi-million-dollar deal with ESPN and sold out events across the globe, the UFC has cemented itself as a global powerhouse, you know what I'm saying? Modern era, business-wise, the UFC